The late August air in Willow Creek, Connecticut, hung thick and sweet, like overripe fruit, heavy with the unspoken. Lawns, emerald and impossibly neat, stretched towards sidewalks shaded by ancient maples, their leaves just beginning to hint at the blaze of autumn to come. Colonial houses, painted in tasteful shades of cream and slate blue, stood as silent witnesses to generations of carefully curated lives. Eleanor Vance's home, a meticulously restored 18th century salt box on Sycamore Lane, was no exception. From the outside, it was the very picture of New England charm, a testament to the American dream she believed she and Michael were living. Inside, Eleanor, 38, moved with a quiet grace that mirrored the ordered beauty of her surroundings. Her freelance graphic design studio, a sun-drenched room overlooking a riot of late summer blooms in her meticulously tended garden, was her sanctuary. Currently, she was immersed in a series of botanical illustrations for a small artisanal tea company, intricate, precise work that demanded focus and a steady hand, qualities she prided herself on. The delicate veins of a camellia leaf, the subtle blush on a rosehip. These details were her solace, a world she could control and render beautiful. Michael, her husband of 12 years, was, as he often was these days, away. A critical business conference. In Chicago, he'd said, his voice smooth and reassuring over the phone the night before. He was a senior financial advisor, a man whose profession exuded stability and acumen. His success had afforded them this life in Willow Creek, the vacations, the comfortable buffer against the harsher realities of the world. Or so Eleanor had believed. Lately, however, a subtle dissonance had crept into their marital harmony. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor beneath the surface of their routines. Michael was more preoccupied, his smiles sometimes not quite reaching his eyes, his affections feeling more performative than deeply felt. He attributed it to work stress, the pressures of the market. Eleanor, ever trusting, ever willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, had accepted this. She had her work, her garden, the comforting rhythm of their life. She didn't probe. Perhaps a small, disquieted part of her didn't want to. The air in the house felt different when Michael was gone. Quieter, yes, but also holding a certain tension, as if the walls themselves were exhaling secrets he took with him. It was during one such exhalation, on a sweltering Saturday morning with the cicadas thrumming a relentless beat outside, that the first thread of their carefully woven life began to unravel. She was searching for an old insurance policy, something mundane in Michael's home office, a room that, unlike her own sunlit studio, always felt a bit formal, a bit closed off. His antique mahogany desk, a family heirloom, dominated the space. As she sifted through neatly labeled files in a drawer, her fingers brushed against a small, almost invisible catch on the underside of the desktop. Curiosity, a rare and unsettling impulse concerning Michael's private domain, pricked at her. She pressed. A narrow, shallow compartment, no bigger than a shoebox lid, sprang open with a soft click. Her breath caught. It was the kind of secret compartment one read about in novels, not something one found in the desk of a suburban financial advisor. Inside, nestled amongst a few old stock certificates, was a thick manila envelope, unlabeled. And beneath it, a slim, leather-bound journal, its clasp securely locked. A cold dread, sharp and unfamiliar, snaked through her. This was not Michael. Not the Michael she knew, the man who shared his passwords, his plans, his life, she thought, with her. Her hands trembled as she lifted the manila envelope. It was heavier than it looked. Inside, a cascade of paper, letters, stark and official, from names she didn't recognize. Apex Recovery Services, Sentinel Credit Solutions, Consolidated Debt Management. Most were addressed to Michael, a few to Mr. and Mrs. Michael Vance. They were printed on aggressive, brightly colored paper, crimson, urgent yellow. Final notice, one screamed in bold capitals, legal action imminent. She sank into Michael's imposing leather chair, the scent of his expensive cologne clinging to the upholstery, now feeling suffocating. Her vision blurred. Credit cards she'd never heard of, Platinum Elite, Premier Access, a dozen more, each with balances that made her stomach clench. 10,000, 15,000, 25,000. Personal loans from entities with vaguely threatening names. Payday lenders. The sums were astronomical, a dizzying mountain of debt that felt utterly unreal. How? When? And why had he never said a word? The room seemed to tilt. The meticulously arranged books on Michael's shelves, symbols of his intellect and knowledge, now seemed to mock her. The framed photos of them smiling, on a beach in Maui, at a black tie gala, in front of this very house, felt like props from a stage play whose plot she had catastrophically misunderstood. Then her gaze fell upon the locked journal. The dread intensified, coiling in her stomach like a viper. She had to know. But where would he keep a key to something so obviously meant to be hidden? Her eyes scanned the desk, the shelves. Tucked behind a silver-framed photo of his late father, almost invisible, was a tiny ornate brass key. Her fingers fumbled with the clasp, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she could feel it in her throat. The lock clicked open. She opened the journal to the first page, Michael's familiar, confident script filling the lines. It began innocuously enough. Notes about work, frustrations with the market. But then, a few entries in, a name appeared. Cassandra. Met Cassandra at the gallery opening. Refreshing. So unlike E's predictability. E, that was her. Eleanor. Predictability. The word stung like a physical blow. She read on, her initial shock giving way to a sickening cold horror. Page after page detailed not just one affair, but several. Liaisons described with a chilling detachment, sometimes with cruel comparisons to her. There were notes about clandestine meetings, gifts purchased, were these funded by the secret credit cards? Weekends away that had been disguised as business trips. Cassandra was clearly a longer, more significant involvement, but there were others, fleeting, cynical encounters. He wrote of the thrill of deception, the boredom he felt at home, his needs. The journal wasn't a confession of a struggling man. It was the chronicle of a double life, meticulously curated, callously pursued. The financial ruin was one layer of betrayal, devastating in itself. This emotional evisceration was another entirely. It was a direct assault on her identity, on their shared history, on the very foundation of her belief in him, in them. The botanical illustration she'd been working on, its delicate lines and subtle colors, suddenly seemed like a foolish, naive pursuit of beauty in a world that was, in fact, grotesque and deceptive. The heat of the day, the incessant drone of the cicadas, the cloying sweetness of the air, it all pressed in on her, suffocating. She closed the journal, her hands numb. The vibrant life of Willow Creek, the illusion of their perfect marriage, the man she thought she knew, all of it had shattered into a million irreparable pieces in the space of an hour, in the oppressive quiet of Michael's deceitful office. Eleanor Vance, the trusting wife, the lover of order, was lost, adrift in a sea of lies, with no shore in sight. The unraveling had begun. Michael returned 2 days later, tanned from the Chicago conference that the journal had revealed was actually a weekend in Napa with Cassandra. He breezed in, all easy charm and feigned enthusiasm to be home, a duty-free gift bag for Eleanor in hand. "Miss me?" he asked, leaning in for a kiss. Eleanor recoiled as if from a flame. The scent of his cologne, once a comforting familiarity, now reeked of duplicity. She had spent the past 48 hours in a daze of shock and burgeoning rage, the journal and the debt letters hidden away, their poisonous contents seared into her mind. She hadn't slept. Food tasted like ash. Her reflection in the mirror was a stranger, pale, eyes wide with a haunted knowledge. "We need to talk, Michael," she said, her voice flat, devoid of its usual warmth. It was the calm before a storm she wasn't sure she had the strength to unleash or survive. He frowned, his practiced smile faltering. "Everything okay, Elle? You look tired." They sat in the living room, the afternoon sun, now lower in the sky, casting long, accusatory shadows across the expensive Persian rug. The room, usually filled with the soft glow of their shared life, felt like a courtroom. Eleanor placed the manila envelope and the leather-bound journal on the polished mahogany coffee table between them. Michael's eyes flickered towards them, a flicker so brief she might have missed it if she hadn't been watching his every micro-expression. His face, for a split second, lost its carefully constructed composure. A subtle tightening around his jaw, a sudden stillness. "What's this?" he asked, his voice a careful, neutral tone. "I think you know," Eleanor said, her own voice trembling despite her efforts to control it. She gestured towards the envelope. "This is from Apex Recovery. Sentinel Credit, consolidated debt. They say we owe them. A lot of money, Michael. Money I knew nothing about." He attempted a dismissive wave of his hand, a manufactured nonchalance. "Oh, that. It's just some aggressive marketing, Elle. A mix-up. I'll sort it out." "A mix-up involving tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars?" Her voice rose, edged with a hysteria she was desperately trying to suppress. "Threatening legal action, Michael? These are final notices." He sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Look, there were some investments that didn't pan out as expected. I was going to tell you. I just didn't want to worry you. The classic, patronizing deflection. Worry me? The dam of her composure was cracking. And this? She pushed the journal towards him. Is this also something you didn't want to worry me about? His gaze dropped to the journal, and this time, the color visibly drained from his face. He looked up at her, his eyes darting, cornered. Where did you get that? Does it matter, Michael? Is it true? He stared at the journal, then back at her, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. Then came the first volley of gaslighting. Eleanor, you know I wouldn't. That's my private journal. You had no right to read it. You're twisting things, taking them out of context. Out of context? Her voice was now a raw wound. You wrote about Cassandra, Michael, about weekends in Napa, about how predictable I am, about others. Is that out of context? Each word was an agony to speak, a confirmation of the nightmare. He stood up, pacing, the charming facade crumbling to reveal something agitated and defensive underneath. It's not what you think. Those were complicated situations, stress relief. They meant nothing. Meant nothing? Eleanor felt a cold fury rise through the pain. Our marriage, our vows, my trust in you, did that mean nothing? The confrontation raged for hours. Michael, cornered by the irrefutable evidence of the journal, shifted tactics. Denials gave way to minimization. It was a mistake. It was just a few times. Then to blame. I've been under so much pressure. You've been so distant lately, so wrapped up in your work. He even tried to turn it back on her, accusing her of snooping, of violating his privacy, as if her discovery were the greater transgression. Eleanor listened, a part of her detaching, observing him as if he were a specimen under a microscope. The man she had loved, or thought she loved, was capable of such profound, calculated cruelty. The revelations of the affairs, layered upon the shock of the hidden debt, were a 1-2 punch that left her reeling, gasping for air. The sheer scale of his deception was breathtaking. He hadn't just lied. He had constructed an entirely separate existence, funded by money they didn't have, built on the wreckage of their supposed shared life. By nightfall, Michael, exhausted and perhaps realizing the futility of his deflections, finally offered a semblance of admission, though it was riddled with self-pity and excuses. I messed up, Elle. I know I messed up. Badly. But we can fix this. The money, the other stuff. We can go to counseling. Please don't throw away 12 years. His pleas, which once might have moved her, now sounded hollow, manipulative. 12 years. Had any of it been real? The house, once her sanctuary, now felt contaminated, every surface a reminder of his lies. The beautiful order she had cultivated in her life, in her home, had been a fragile illusion, shattered by the ugliness of his secret world. That night, Eleanor slept in the guest room, or rather, lay awake in the guest room, the silence of the house amplifying the cacophony in her head. Tormenting images from the journal, the cold, stark figures of debt, Michael's deceitful face, they played on a relentless loop. Each breath was a struggle, a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. Grief, sharp and visceral, tore through her. Grief for the husband she thought she had, for the marriage she believed in, for the future that had been stolen. Anger, too, a white-hot rage that left her trembling. And beneath it all, a profound, terrifying sense of shame and foolishness. How could she have been so blind? The following days blurred into a nightmarish landscape. The debt collectors, as if sensing a shift, escalated their efforts. The phone rang incessantly, harsh, demanding voices on the other end. Certified letters, ominous and official, piled up on the hall table, each one a fresh stab of anxiety. Eleanor, who had always prided herself on her financial responsibility, felt overwhelmed by a world of liens, defaults, and credit scores she didn't understand. Willow Creek, with its pristine facade and unspoken social codes, suddenly felt like a panopticon. She imagined neighbors whispering, judging. The friendly waves from across the street felt laden with suspicion. Michael, meanwhile, oscillated. One moment he was contrite, tearful, begging for another chance, promising to change, to fix everything. The next, he was sullen and withdrawn, retreating into his office, the scene of her devastating discovery. He made vague promises about consolidating the debt, about making amends, but his actions were minimal, his understanding of the depth of her wound appallingly shallow. He seemed more concerned with salvaging his image, with the potential fallout for his career, than with the emotional devastation he had wrought. Eleanor felt herself sinking. Her design work, her beautiful, precise illustrations, lay untouched. The vibrant colors on her palette seemed to mock her gray, desolate world. How could she create beauty when her own life was in such ugly disarray? Sleep offered no escape, only a brief troubled respite before waking to the crushing weight of reality. Food was tasteless. The garden, once her joy, was now just another reminder of a life that had been a lie, its late summer blooms wilting unheeded. One particularly bleak afternoon, as yet another aggressive call from a collection agency ended with a thinly veiled threat, Eleanor found herself staring at her reflection in the darkened screen of her computer. The woman looking back was a ghost of her former self, her eyes hollow, her face etched with a sorrow so profound it seemed to have aged her years in a matter of days. In that moment of stark self-appraisal, a tiny, flickering ember of defiance ignited within her. She could not let him destroy her completely. She would not. Her first call was to Lena Rodriguez, her best friend since their art school days in Providence. Lena, now a successful architect in Boston, was everything Eleanor felt she wasn't at that moment. Strong, decisive, fiercely independent. As Eleanor's voice broke, recounting the nightmare of the past week, Lena listened, not with pity, but with a quiet, simmering fury on Eleanor's behalf. "I'm coming down," Lena said, her voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "Pack a small bag if you want or don't. Just be ready. I'll be there in 2 hours." Lena's arrival was like a blast of cleansing, bracing air in the suffocating atmosphere of the Vance house. She took one look at Eleanor's ravaged face, at Michael's pathetic attempts at conciliation, and her expression hardened. "Michael," she said, her tone arctic, "Eleanor and I are going out. We'll be back when we're back. Don't wait up." She bundled Eleanor into her car, and as they drove away from Sycamore Lane, away from the house of lies, Eleanor felt the first tentative release of a pressure she hadn't realized she was carrying. Lena didn't offer platitudes. She offered outrage, validation, and a clear, pragmatic path forward. "First thing Monday, you're seeing a lawyer," Lena declared, her eyes fixed on the road. "A shark, the best divorce lawyer in Connecticut. Second, you're finding a therapist. You need to talk to someone who isn't me, someone who can help you process this monumental betrayal." And so began the arduous process of dismantling one life and tentatively, painfully, starting to build another. The lawyer Lena found, a sharp, empathetic woman named Miss Albright, who later referred her to Dr. Evelyn Hayes for therapy, laid out the grim realities of marital debt in a community property state, the complexities of divorce when assets were entangled with such massive hidden liabilities. The house, their biggest asset, would almost certainly have to be sold. Therapy sessions with Dr. Hayes were like carefully lancing a deep, infected wound. In the calm, quiet space of Dr. Hayes' office, with its muted colors and comfortable armchairs, Eleanor began to unpack the layers of her trauma. The grief was overwhelming, a tsunami that threatened to pull her under. There was the loss of Michael, or rather the man she thought Michael was. The loss of their shared history, now tainted and suspect. The loss of her own naivety, her innocent trust. "It's not just the affairs or the money," Eleanor choked out in one session, tears streaming down her face. "It's the realization that I was living a lie, that the person I shared my bed with, my life with, was a stranger, a cruel stranger. How could I not have known? What does that say about me?" Dr. Hayes listened with a deep, compassionate patience. "Eleanor," she said gently, her voice a calm anchor in Eleanor's storm, "skilled manipulators are adept at creating illusions. It's not a reflection of your intelligence or worth that you believed him. It's a reflection of his capacity for deceit and your capacity for trust, which is, in itself, not a failing." Slowly, painstakingly, Eleanor began to piece together the fragments of her shattered self. Dr. Hayes helped her identify the patterns of Michael's manipulation, the subtle gaslighting that had gone on for years, eroding Eleanor's confidence in her own perceptions. She began to understand that her predictability, as Michael had so cruelly put it in his journal, was actually her stability, her loyalty, her commitment, qualities he had exploited. Meanwhile, the practicalities of the situation were a constant, grinding pressure. The phone calls from creditors continued. Michael, facing the undeniable prospect of divorce and financial ruin, became more erratic. Some days he was a broken man, full of remorse and desperate pleas. Other days, he was angry, blaming the economy, his bosses, even Eleanor's lack of support for his stress. He made half-hearted attempts to find solutions for the debt, but mostly he seemed paralyzed by shame and the impending collapse of his carefully constructed world. His image, so vital to his sense of self, was disintegrating, and he didn't know how to cope. Eleanor, drawing on a strength she didn't know she possessed, began to deal with the debt collectors herself. Armed with information from her lawyer and a script Lena helped her write, she faced them down, her voice shaking but firm. She learned about her rights, about negotiation, about the long, hard road to financial recovery. Each small victory, a successfully negotiated payment plan, a creditor agreeing to stop calling her directly, was a tiny step towards reclaiming her agency. Her relationship with her family underwent its own evolution. Her younger brother, David, a pragmatic software engineer in California, was unequivocally supportive, offering financial help, which Eleanor, determined to stand on her own feet, politely declined for now, and practical advice. "He's a con artist, Elle," David said bluntly over a video call, his anger palpable. "Cut him loose. You deserve so much better." Her parents, retired in Florida, were initially more hesitant, their traditional views on marriage making them hope for reconciliation. "Are you sure, dear?" her mother had asked, her voice laced with concern. Marriage is about forgiveness, about working through difficult times. But as Eleanor, with newfound clarity, explained the depth of Michael's betrayal, not just a mistake, but a sustained campaign of deception, their stance shifted. Their concern for the sanctity of marriage was replaced by a fierce, protective love for their daughter. Autumn arrived in Willow Creek, its vibrant colors, a stark contrast to the grayness of Eleanor's emotional landscape. The leaves on the maples outside her window turned brilliant shades of red and gold, then fell, carpeting the pristine lawns in a melancholic beauty. The house on Sycamore Lane, once a symbol of her dreams, now felt like a gilded cage. The for sale sign hammered into the front lawn by the realtor was both a beacon of hope and a symbol of profound loss. She began to sort through their possessions, a heartbreaking archaeology of a shared life. Each object, a photograph, a piece of pottery they'd bought on a trip, a book Michael had given her, was laden with memories, now irrevocably tainted. Some days, the grief was so overwhelming she could only sit on the floor, surrounded by boxes, and weep. Lena drove down on weekends, helping her sort, pack, and discard, her presence a steady, unwavering comfort. Mrs. Gable, her elderly neighbor, would occasionally leave a small pot of homemade soup or a plate of cookies on the doorstep, a quiet gesture of kindness that meant more than words. Eleanor found a small, two-bedroom apartment in a neighboring town, a town without the suffocating polish of Willow Creek. It was modest, a little worn around the edges, but it was hers. It felt clean, untainted by Michael's lies. As she began to unpack the few belongings she had chosen to keep, she felt a flicker of something akin to hope. It was a fragile thing, easily extinguished by a wave of sadness or a fresh onslaught of legal paperwork, but it was there. Her design work, so long neglected, began to call to her again. She set up a small studio space in her new apartment, by a window that looked out onto a small park. At first, her hand felt clumsy, her creative well dry. But slowly, tentatively, she began to sketch. Not the intricate botanical illustrations of before, but simpler forms, more abstract expressions of the turmoil and resilience she was experiencing. There was a rawness to her new work, an honesty that had perhaps been missing before. The winter that followed was long and bleak, mirroring the internal landscape Eleanor continued to navigate. The divorce proceedings dragged on, the financial settlements complex and emotionally draining. Michael, stripped of his grand facade, was a diminished figure. He'd had to leave his prestigious job due to the scandal of his debts and the ensuing loss of client trust. He was living in a small, characterless apartment, facing the consequences of his choices in a stark, undeniable way. Eleanor felt a strange mix of pity and detachment when she thought of him. He was no longer the monster who haunted her dreams, but simply a broken, flawed man who had caused immeasurable pain. Her focus was shifting, slowly but surely, from him to herself. The climax of her internal journey wasn't a single dramatic event, but a gradual dawning of clarity, a quiet strengthening of her resolve. It culminated one late February afternoon, during a mediation session with Michael and their respective lawyers. The air in the sterile conference room was thick with unspoken resentments and financial calculations. Michael, looking haggard and defeated, was attempting to negotiate a more favorable settlement, his arguments laced with familiar undertones of self-pity. Eleanor listened, her hands clasped calmly in her lap. Dr. Hayes's words echoed in her mind. "You cannot control his actions or his remorse, Eleanor. You can only control your own responses, your own boundaries." When it was her turn to speak, her voice was low but steady, devoid of the anger and anguish that had once consumed her. She looked directly at Michael, not with hatred, but with a profound, sorrowful clarity. "Michael," she began, "I have accepted the reality of what has happened. I have accepted the losses, financial, emotional, all of it. The house is sold, the debts are being managed. What I will not accept any further is an attempt to diminish the impact of your actions or to prolong this pain." She then laid out her final, non-negotiable terms for the division of the remaining meager assets and the finalization of the divorce. There was no venom in her tone, only an unshakable firmness. She was no longer the weeping, shattered woman from months ago. She was a survivor, scarred but not broken, her eyes clear, her spirit, though battered, intact. Michael stared at her, perhaps for the first time seeing not the wife he had betrayed, but the woman she was becoming. Someone beyond his power to manipulate or deceive. A flicker of something. Was it shame? Regret? True remorse? Crossed his face. He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "Okay, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Okay." It wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. There was no triumph, no exultation, only a profound, weary sense of an ending and the terrifying, liberating prospect of a new, unknown beginning. As she walked out of the lawyer's office into the crisp, late winter air, Eleanor felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in what felt like a lifetime. The heavy chains of her past with Michael, if not entirely gone, felt significantly loosened. The following weeks were a blur of legal signatures. Final goodbyes to the Willow Creek house, now sold to a young family full of hopeful dreams, a poignant irony, and the slow, steady work of building her new, solitary life. Moving into her small apartment had been a symbolic act of reclamation. It was a blank canvas, and she was, for the first time in a long time, the sole artist of her own existence. She painted the walls a soft, hopeful yellow. She filled the small balcony with pots of herbs and early spring flowers, pansies, primroses, tiny resilient spots of color against the gray cityscape. These small acts of creation were therapeutic, grounding. Her design business, which she had painstakingly begun to revive, started to attract new clients, small, local businesses, a women's shelter needing a new logo, an organic farm. The work felt meaningful, aligned with her renewed sense of self. There were still hard days, days when the ghost of Michael's betrayal would rise unbidden, bringing with it a fresh wave of grief or a surge of lingering anger. Days when the loneliness felt acute, the future uncertain. But these moments, Dr. Hayes had assured her, were part of the healing process, not a sign of regression. "Healing isn't a linear path, Eleanor," Dr. Hayes had said. "It's a spiral. You may revisit old feelings, but each time you do so from a higher vantage point, with more understanding and strength." Lena remained her staunchest ally, their bond forged even stronger in the crucible of Eleanor's crisis. They spoke almost daily, Lena's pragmatic optimism a constant source of encouragement. Her brother David checked in regularly, his quiet support a comforting presence. Even Mrs. Gable from Willow Creek sent a small potted orchid to her new apartment with a card that simply read, "New beginnings, dear Eleanor. May they bloom brightly." Michael largely faded from her life. She heard, through the lawyer, that he was struggling, working a lower-paying job, trying to rebuild his finances and his reputation. She felt no malice towards him, only a distant sadness for the waste, for the potential he had squandered, for the damage he had inflicted not only on her, but ultimately on himself. Forgiveness, she was learning, was not about excusing his actions, but about releasing herself from the poison of resentment. She wasn't there yet, not fully, but she was on the path. Spring arrived in earnest, breathing new life into the city. The trees in the park outside her window burst into leaf, the air filled with the scent of damp earth and blossoming flowers. One Saturday morning, Eleanor took her sketchbook and a thermos of tea to the park. She found a quiet bench overlooking a small pond where ducks glided serenely. She didn't sketch the grand vistas or the perfect blooms that had once captivated her. Instead, she found herself drawing the gnarled trunk of an old oak tree, its bark deeply furrowed, its branches reaching towards the sky, weathered but resilient. She drew the way the sunlight filtered through the new leaves, creating dappled patterns on the grass. She drew the small, imperfect details of life unfolding around her. A small, tentative smile touched her lips. She was not the Eleanor Vance of Willow Creek anymore, the woman whose life had been built on a foundation of carefully constructed illusions. That Eleanor was gone, lost in the wreckage of Michael's deceit. The woman who sat on this park bench, sketching in the gentle spring sunshine, was someone new. Someone quieter, perhaps, but also infinitely stronger. Someone who had walked through fire and emerged not unscathed, but profoundly, irrevocably changed. Her dreams were different now. They were no longer about grand houses or perfect marriages. They were about authenticity, about inner peace, about finding joy in small everyday moments, about using her talents to create work that had meaning, both for herself and for others, about nurturing the relationships that had sustained her, with Lena, with David, with the kind souls like Mrs. Gable, who had shown her compassion. The journey was far from over. The scars of betrayal would likely always remain, subtle reminders of the pain she had endured, but they were no longer gaping wounds. They were part of her story, testament to her resilience. As she closed her sketchbook and sipped her tea, Eleanor felt a sense of quiet hope settle over her. The future was uncertain, yes, but it was also hers to shape. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough. It felt like everything. The unraveling had led not to annihilation, but to a quiet, hard-won, and deeply personal recreation.